Good morning, everybody. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I always love when I look at the attendees and I see all of my friends on there. That's always really nice. Today, we're going to talk about FAIR's tools for COVID-19. We're going to record this session, so you guys don't have to take notes feverishly, and we have a lot of specific tools that we're going to be talking about that we're going to push out to you. So you can be looking for those things to come to you afterwards. Holly, hi. Holly, Michael was just telling me that you guys are friends, and that made me very happy. So I'm glad to see you joining. I'm Rachel Phillips-Buck, VP for Student Success at FAIR's Resources, and I'm joined today by Michael Burns, who is the Dean of Students for the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor. And I'm going to do a big introduction of him in just a minute, but I want to first talk about kind of our roadmap for today and why this webinar, you had such short notice to attend this webinar, but also the urgency that I feel to get this information out to you and get these tools out to you. So let me start with the roadmap. I want to talk about how we know each other and introduce you. I want to talk about what is happening in the fall, because as always, it is ever changing. We're trying to figure it out. I feel like a lot of us kind of have come to out of the craziness of the summer and been like, oh my goodness, fall is like now a week away or 2 weeks away or 3 weeks away. I want to talk about that. And then I want to give you an example of the process that Michael and his team came up with to manage and track COVID cases. And then we'll also talk about some of the FAIR's tools that we're building based on that process that we're going to push out to you so that you can use that. Megan said, don't mention how close fall is, please. We're still in a place where we do not want to acknowledge that. Let me say to you guys, this is a little bit more of an informal webinar than we usually do. The group is much smaller. These are all FAIR's clients. So please, my goal is for this to be a time for us to talk to each other about what we're doing, for us to learn from each other. If you have questions, if you want to tell me what you're doing on your campus to manage different scenarios with COVID, accommodations and conduct and all of that kind of stuff, I really want for this to be a time where our community is talking about what's coming and what we're going to do about it. So please chat your questions. I'll be watching that and we'll address them. And then also we'll have time for questions at the end. So I want this to be helpful to you. So let me introduce Michael to you. Like I said, he's the Dean of Students at Mary Hardin-Baylor. And you've only been there just a couple of years.
Yeah,
and you were before you were where?
So I was at two different places. Just before I was at Oklahoma City University for 2.5 years, and then about 12 years at Oklahoma Baptist University. Yeah.
That's great. So the reason I asked Michael to join me is because I think it was like in June, he said, hey, we're developing this process to manage COVID cases. Is that something that we can use FAIRS 360 for? And so we had a meeting and he just said, here's all the things that I want to be able to do. And we went through all of the tools and set them up. And so you guys have been managing those cases since when?
Since June. I mean, I think the next day we started using it. I just spent hours kind of setting up the process, and then we managed. We already had cases and we were starting to do it in spreadsheets, and I said, let's not do that.
Please don't. I always say, if you're doing a thing in a spreadsheet, please let FAIRS 360 do it for you, because we have some tools that'll make it easier. So can you tell me, from June until now, you've had about how many cases that you've managed?
We have probably managed 70, I think 70 in and out, 80 cases, and not all of them have resulted in cases. So I bet we've had 100 contacts at some level. So.
And you guys are doing that based on symptom. You explained this to me the other day, that it's symptom management, not.
That's right. So we made it, the CDC has two different ways to do it. It's either testing management or symptom management. And we made the choice to go with symptoms as a university, not our team necessarily.
Yeah.
And so that's how we base it on, is our symptoms. So.
Which I would just say starting out is super helpful, because I think a lot of schools, especially smaller ones, are feeling anxiety about not being able to get the testing. So the idea that you could base it on symptoms. So for those of you who don't know, University of Mary Hardin-Baylor, it's in Belton, similar size to many of the schools that are attending right now. I had no idea that it was the oldest continually operating college in Texas. Congratulations.
There you go.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I think for most of our attendees, the kind of makeup of your school will be very similar.
Very
I think
similar.
we're dealing with similar faculty and student ratios. Can you tell me what you guys, in terms of opening for the fall, are you doing online, on ground, hybrid? What are you doing for that?
So we have the hybrid flex. So we're doing face-to-face, but all of our courses that can be have a flex model where they can be face-to-face or watch live synchronously, or watch later asynchronously. And the faculty are, I think they're kind of eliminating attendance and replacing it with, I can't remember what it's called. They labeled it ARA, but I think it's just some kind of assignment or a record of learning at some level. So they can do it live, face-to-face, live, virtually, or within a certain amount of time. So.
And are students choosing that, or how's that falling out?
Yeah, if it's not a lab or an activity class that can't be done virtually, then they can make the choice, and they can make the choice anytime. It doesn't have, they're not required to make a choice now and decide what they want to do. They can make it in each day.
So
now
that's fluid.
There are some classes that they've had to create cohorts within that section to say this A cohort meets on face-to-face on Monday, this B cohort meets face-to-face on Wednesday. So
because of class size, is that why they're doing that?
Right. Yeah, class size. Yeah.
I would be really curious to hear from our attendees what you guys are doing. If you're doing kind of all the models as Michael just described, or if you're going purely to online. I think that has some influence on how you manage COVID cases, right? If you have the flexibility to quarantine or isolate students versus they're all online or they're on ground and we don't know what we're going to do about that. So I'd be curious to hear that from our attendees. Okay, so I want to focus our conversation. The important thing to remember is that what I'm hearing from a lot of schools is that they're looking at COVID cases in 3 different ways. They're looking at COVID cases in terms of COVID care, which doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is sick or something's going on. That might just be their family is being affected, or they're feeling overwhelmed, or they're not doing well in their classes. So COVID care is just for all of our students in the middle of this craziness. How are we supporting them? There's COVID conduct, which some schools are changing their conduct policies to say you have to wear a mask. If you don't, there's a conduct violation. Don't go to COVID parties, please. That's a violation, right? So there's COVID conduct, which you might be doing. And I don't know, have you guys added any of those kind of rules to your code of conduct?
Yeah, we've added a few policies related to, just following the health and safety protocols. We've tried to take a really light approach, like educational approach, as opposed to a
punitive kind
of.
Punitive,
yeah.
So Michael and I were talking earlier, can we just say there's not going to be a right answer across the board for everything? I mean, the chances that of the 100 decisions we have to make as institutions, we're going to hit every single one exactly right is non-existent, honestly. So everybody is going to have a different opinion about what should happen. Schools are going to do that completely differently. We're at the place now, because we're coming up on school starting, where we got to solve problems. Now we got to be in the place where we're like, okay, here's what we're actually going to do about it. So I think that that's a really good caveat. We are going to spend most of our time today in the tools that we've built for you in Pharos talking about COVID accommodations, which is we've identified students who either have symptoms, have been around people who had symptoms, have traveled, have taken a test, something's going on, and now we've got to figure out what is the plan for how we're going to manage those over the course of their quarantine and their isolation piece. And the basic workflow for this, which you guys will recognize in 360, you're doing this across all of your cohorts, is how do we find them? How do we manage them? How do we manage the process? How do we manage the kind of case it is? How do we talk to people through the system and give them what they need to know? How do we resolve the cases, and how do we measure? So if you just think of it like that's a basic workflow for COVID accommodations, that's a very good starting place. But I do want to talk specifically about what you guys have done. So let's start in the very beginning. Who was involved in creating this process? Like, what were the hardships? Can you just start at the beginning with that for us?
Yeah, and I think we have, having had a couple months in this, we've had to adjust our process as we have found new things. But we basically started in student life and said we need to respond to these, and we identified who needed to be involved. Some positionally, but then some, like our chaplain, he's the dean of spiritual life, is a retired Army chaplain, and so his operational skills are phenomenal.
Wow.
And so he helped us really shape. In fact, our response plan, that all the mapping he sat down and did, and just because he's skilled at doing it. So we took a both, and like who needs to because of their responsibility, and who has some skills that will help us. And so we jumped. That's how we kind of selected, and then we've added people. Seeing new cases or new problems to solve, we've added people that are positionally fit for that.
So is it, so in terms of that, the initiative lives in student life?
The initiative in terms of managing cases lives in student life, and so we talked about this before the webinar, but we had to kind of come to terms with our own opinions. I mean, we've been talking about COVID to people since we've developed this process, and we have to, like, we've gone to athletics or to the Dean's Council, and each group has to kind of process, ask from their own lens, what are the issues, identify some of those, grieve a little bit, complain about that it sucks, and then move past it. We've been processing things for a month, and it doesn't bother me anymore, or 2 months. I think in the end we decided our opinions are really irrelevant. What's our playbook? What are the rules? What does the university say is our plan? What are our processes? And then just go with the decision making from that, regardless of what we think about masks or the danger or the lack of danger, or any kind of things that influence that. This is what it is, and so here's where we are. And I can tell you, our task force differs tremendously on our opinions about it, but it's irrelevant because this is what we have to do. So we had to kind of get over that part of it, but it's okay. We talking to like, for instance, RDs. I spent an hour and a half talking to RDs about the process. Here's what we're doing. This is how we do. We meet every day. And you could see some of the weight lift off a little bit, but they had to complain, so we can't do ping pong or whatever. Yeah, you're right. So I'm sorry, but here we are. So start getting creative about what you can do. And I think that pressure was relieved. Like, okay, sure. It is what it is. So let's move on.
So all that pre-work to say, this stinks, right? I feel like
if I didn't have to hear the word COVID again, I would not.
Right. We would all be happy. We would all be in a much happier place. And I think that as I think about where people get stuck, I think they do sometimes get stuck in the place where they're just like, this is hard. I hate this. This makes me very unhappy, right? And so if your school is not already in that process, you got to go really fast there, because where you will get in trouble is if you don't acknowledge the reality of it, and then it comes and you're unprepared.
Yeah, and I have learned in talking to, like, I've done a session with RDs and then went to all the coaches, and I've had to learn to be patient with where people are and be compassionate toward that. Like, it's okay that they're really processing it.
Yeah.
Even though I don't need to anymore, because we got stuff to do. But be compassionate. Like, it's okay. I get it. I get that it's frustrating for you, and let them kind of I mean, honestly, just let them grieve that, and then move on. So
I think that's right. And I think that's the right language, grieving. Like we have to grieve this, and then we've got to move forward.
and we've been grieving since March, right?
Yeah.
And we don't know how personal this is. For me, it's not been very personal. I haven't experienced it one-on-one with anybody, or no one close to me has really dealt harshly with it. But we know that people have, and so there's no reason not to be compassionate toward people for that.
I agree. So step one is let's do all the pre-work to make sure that people are in a place where we can then tell them this is what we're actually going to do. And I know this is hard to read. This is the mapping that you were talking about. So your playbook's really amazing. And I've just put in all of the things that you had here. Can you talk to us just broadly about the components of your plan? And then I want to spend some time first on quarantine, and then I want to spend some time on isolation. So can you lay out that for me?
Yeah, and so I think we had to figure some of this out, untangle a little bit. When we had one case, one person could walk through all these steps. But one time we had 30 cases at one time, and it happened to be a cohort of students on campus that it worked out like that.
Yeah.
And then at that point we said, okay, we've got to make sure we utilize Pharos so that we can all access the process and identify who needs to do what, so we can handle this at a higher level. I can walk one person through, but I cannot walk 40 people through and still do my job. Yep. And that was the other thing. We don't have the resources to hire one person just to do COVID stuff. We wanted to, but I think the more that we've included this process in a system that's accessible, it's not hard to add people into it.
Yeah.
So
that's a really good point. So sorry, let me just interrupt you. I really love that idea that so in the same way that you're saying this is our policy and this is what we're doing, when you have a process that you can invite more people in, it's scalable. And I can tell you so many of the attendees are like wearing 50 hats already and struggle with, how do I teach other people? And I think if you have it in the system where you can say, this is a straightforward process, we can invite more people in if we have higher volumes, and I'm finding that I can't manage it.
And it doesn't take someone at the dean level to teach someone to come into the process. We can have an admin assistant who has been involved. Our admin for student life is incredibly involved, and she's our go-to. Hey, okay, we need to add this. Spend 30 minutes with this person to talk, and she's phenomenal because the process is accessible. So
that's great.
So so our basic process is we have a mandatory reporting of symptoms, contact, or positive test, and we process those mandatory reports. We're not going out and seeking anything. I don't even know how you do that, but and then we kind of share the load in responding to it. So the vice president and I are the ones who make the initial intake phone call, and we have an intake form, and we ask questions about what happened, where are they, and then determine the route that they need to go, which is the difference between quarantine and isolation.
So let's break that apart, because this is how Mary Hardin-Baylor has defined it, but there's room for interpretation, right? I mean, there's not at Mary Hardin-Baylor, but in the world, people are going to think about these different things.
This is from our playbook. Yes, 100%.
Okay.
Yep. So quarantine is 14 days, and it's someone who has been exposed to someone in close contact. And our definition of close contact is within 6 feet for longer than 15 minutes. It has nothing to do with masks or anything like that. So, for instance, I've dealt with several cases where a student said, I took medicine to my grandmother, and I was there, I dropped it off, I said goodbye, but she tested positive. Well, that person was not in close contact, so we didn't open a case. Now, we still said, hey, you need to monitor your symptoms just like you have been and report if something happens.
Yeah.
But so that's how we've determined it, close contact with someone who is a confirmed COVID positive test. Not my grandmother's friend tested positive and I hung out with my grandmother, but a confirmed positive test. And so that's 14 days of quarantine.
So when that happens, you tell them, hey, okay, this is the plan. This is what we're going to do.
Yep. And so from there, I always explain, here's what's going to happen, 14 days. We're going to check in with you every 3 days. And we use the contact timeline on the case management to say, okay, everybody that's 3 days, we're going to phone. Right now, we've been able to just make phone calls. If that scales up, we may need to just click everybody and send out a template, email template, just checking in. But we have a check-in, also a check-in contact form that we use. We don't answer every question all the time, but it's a good template for us. And then, so I'll explain that you're in quarantine for these days. Pay attention to your symptoms. Let us know if anything comes up. And here's the date that we're projecting. And we use that date feature in the case management we put that as the last day of their quarantine, and we might shift it or so that we know, all right, this is when we need to make our last kind of call to ramp them back into being cleared off our caseload.
When Michael came to me with this process, I think I've told many of you, next week, I'm hoping we're going to push out the due date for statuses, and I'll show it to you today, but that's going to be super helpful in this process to just be able to say it's 2 weeks from now, that you'll get a reminder that those people then are going to be off quarantine.
And that helped us so much, because that's what we deal with on a daily basis to see who do we need to track right now. Who needs to come back into it. So
good. Well, I've been asking for that for a very long time, so I'm so happy to be able to give it to you guys. You guys, questions about quarantine, please send those. I saw Celeste ask if we can send the PDF. I will send you a bunch of tools for you to be able to use, plus this webinar. So we definitely will be sharing these resources. Related to quarantine, you also have a Res Life plan, correct?
Yeah, so we haven't really had to utilize this that much because we have limited on-campus people right now. We have less than 100 that are living on campus. But yeah, we will notify the director of Res Life about when a quarantine happens. When we are all face-to-face, we're going to have to make some decisions. Someone can quarantine in their own room. Quarantine is kind of what we've defined it as. Quarantine is you live in your own house. Isolation is you stay in your bedroom. And so we'll have to make some decisions. Isolation is someone who has symptoms or tested positive. And our first option is for them to go isolate at home. And we've stated that in our plan. But for those who can't, for whatever reason, we'll work out a place for them to be. And sorry, what was that? Where was that?
Oh, you were exactly right. We just, we were talking about Res Life for quarantine.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
So there's some decision making there. Who stays, who goes, where do we put them? How do we manage that process? Can they stay? If they're in a room by themselves, then it's no issue.
And that will just get trickier as we move from summer, fewer students on campus.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure how that's going to go yet.
Yeah. I have a question from Megan, which is so the question is, how do you ensure students are reporting? Which I was reading an article the other day about how student life, like the expertise is trying to get students to do things, but they're 18. So sometimes it's very hard, right? Like, so how are you enforcing or communicating about or talking about getting students to tell you?
I don't know that there's a way to make them accept or enforce it. I think if we have found out that someone has tested positive or has symptoms, I don't know that I think being sick in itself is punishment, but we haven't really done that. I say I've averaged 3 or 4 cases a day. So we have not, and it's just summer enrollment. So we haven't really had a problem thus far. We'll get cases from like a student has emailed a professor and said, I can't be at class today. So because I'm sick, and so the professor is also they're mandatory reporters, very similar to Title IX.
Yeah.
So we have some other informants around that can help us do that, but there's not really been a way to do it except that they said they would.
Yeah.
They signed off that they said they would, and that's their agreement. So.
And I have been reading a lot about how we talk about it. We say why. This is why. The reason we're asking you to do this is so that we can protect those that are most vulnerable among us, so that we can stay together as a community, so that, right? So talking to them in terms of why, I think makes a really big difference. Instead of it feeling like we're policing them, we're saying like, we're trying to make it so we can all stay together and you don't have to go back and live in your parents' house with no internet and without your friends. Right.
Well, and we have 3 things they have to work through. Our safe to return to campus plan, they have to sign that they understand it and read it. And it's here's our policies and what's required, but then also here's some of the things that you can do. Here's some resources, that too. Then they also have to fill out basically this community covenant that we will take care of each other, that we're in this to make sure we keep each other safe, and we'll be responsible for that. And then they have to fill out before they come back on campus 72 hours, kind of what you do at a dentist's office. I don't have these symptoms, I'm good to go. Or yes, I did this, and then we follow up with those. So
yeah, I love
that's our process for identifying, or at least saying here's what you're required to do. So.
I love that, because it is controlling the narrative. It is telling them we want to be safe. We are a community. We're checking with each other. And, what we're always saying about parents is you have to make visible the ways that you're trying to keep their kids safe so that they'll feel good sending them back. And so I think
that's great when I get phone calls or an email that says, what are you doing? Do you care? Do you care anything about COVID?
Yeah.
And we can say, yeah, here's
the whole plan.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so isolation, you alluded to this a little bit. This is actually, we have a positive test, or we have symptoms. This person is sick, and we need to keep them away from everyone else.
That's
correct?
Right. That's correct. Yeah.
And then you guys have gone through and said this is when that isolation period
begins and ends. So the first, in this intake phone call, we determine when either did you start symptoms or when did you take the test. And that's been tricky because sometimes the test won't come back, the results won't come back for 8, 9, 10 days. Well, that's the end of isolation. So we kind of have to figure out from the symptoms when they first appeared, and we've only had 2 asymptomatic cases, so that has been helpful. So when did the symptoms appear? Test, did you take a test? Sometimes test positive, negative, if symptoms appear, is fairly irrelevant.
Yeah.
Someone will say, I tested negative. That doesn't, because we've taken the symptoms approach, a test negative doesn't matter. So it's 10 days from the first symptoms, and then they have to be progressively getting better, and then no fever within 72 hours of a return date. And so we go ahead and mark that day 10, but it may be 12, 13, 14, 15.
Based on the 72.
That's right.
Hours.
And then we also have an early return attestation that if a doctor, it's going to be hay fever time, or, we're going to be dealing with other stuff, or someone just ate something that upset their stomach. Unfortunately, there's, 75 symptoms for COVID, and they identify every sickness that could happen. If a student wants to, say, I don't have COVID, a physician can sign and say, this person doesn't have COVID, but they have to say, this is what they really do have.
You have to have a diagnosis besides COVID.
Yeah, and the hardest part, I think, for us with that, there's, we have a student that just has documented migraines through our disabilities office. But that's on the list. The headache is on the list. So we can't, within the playbook, allow them to continue in face-to-face contact until they've been cleared. And either the doctor will say, and we found both cases, the doctor will say, yep, they don't have COVID. This is what it is. I attest to that. Or a doctor will say, I want nothing to do with deciding that liability if they really do. And so they need to go ahead and live their isolation out.
Yeah, I can imagine there's just so many pieces of the entire process, from family and doctor and student, and then all of the university, where we're all feeling just very responsible, and it's a very scary place to be, for sure.
Okay.
Okay, so I think you talked about, let me go back to assigned to isolation. I think you talked about these elements. I just want to go back one more. In terms of like, you find out that they have symptoms, you have this conversation with them, that you talked about the how they come back early, and then how you're going to clear them. You have some residence life specific things as well, which will get more complicated in the fall, right?
That's right. Yeah. So I think the thing that we are going to have to really figure out is roommates, because we made the choice to house people the same that we would. And we're going to have to decide in each case what to do with different people. Can they quarantine or isolate where they are? We're going to work with them, to not have contact. We're going to utilize the resident director a little bit to do check-in, but we have our own task force that's primarily going to do the check-in and wellness kind of care piece. I think day 6 in quarantine or isolation, we start to kind of talk about, are you okay? Do you need counseling services or chaplain service? Something that, you can utilize. Do you need some of that? And we have telehealth kind of options for that. Well, I mean, they're just either FaceTiming or Zooming from their offices, or, it's not that official. It's just whatever technology is available. And so we've kind of kept the resident directors out of a lot of that. That may change if we're up higher and we need some more team members, but right now we're having them focus on just their normal responsibilities.
So after you are doing this isolation, you have a cleaning process policy also. So can you talk about that?
So there's some other pieces too. So if they're in a classroom and they say that in our initial intake with quarantine or isolation, we ask, have you been on campus? Where have you been on campus? And who have you been in close contact with? So even if quarantine, which doesn't really the need for contact is not really necessary, but if it turned into a positive COVID case, we would know that information now, and we don't have to fish for it.
Yeah.
We'll even ask them, what about people not here, just so that they can start processing, do I need to let some people know
at home?
So then we have to notify, and it's me right now, notify our associate provost to identify a classroom that either needs to be shut down, and we've kind of set aside a couple of spaces that we can move classes to if we need to for 24 hours. If it's a positive test, the CDC says you have to wait 24 hours before you go in and clean it. Strangely, if it's symptoms, you don't, and so we've gone in for someone who's had symptoms and cleaned it immediately and made it ready for the next class. So essentially we're shutting it down for 24, 27 hours to be able to be reused again. So
that's super helpful, that distinction between, if you have a test, you have to wait this amount of time, versus if we're just looking at symptoms, it's a little bit different. I think that's really helpful.
So we communicate with the provost and then with our maintenance to contact our cleaning services to go in and do what they need to do to clean, and then we'll begin arranging meals if we need to. That we're just starting that process because our dining hasn't really been open quite like that.
So let me ask you, I want to talk about meals because you have that both for quarantine and isolation. Who is doing cleaning? Is it your regular cleaning people? Did you guys contract with somebody else, or how are you doing that?
Yeah, it's our regular cleaning people. Yep.
Okay.
They have some people that are set aside to do those specific things. So if it's clean a room or a residence hall room or an apartment or a classroom, that's what we'll do now.
I have a question for you. So Carolyn is asking if Mary Hardin-Baylor has an on-campus health services, and if so, what is the reason for making the director of disability services the case manager versus the director of health services?
That is a great question. We only have a nurse, so we don't have a full health services. Yeah, we don't have that.
Okay.
The primary reason was because, and honestly, we only just assigned them as the case manager because it was the next step. So I will call somebody for an intake, and if I get a voicemail or I can't get in contact with them, I will just leave them. I'll assign them to me and keep them, open the case, assign them to me, put waiting for response on there so that I know to follow up the next day or the afternoon, and keep it assigned to me. We assign it to the director of disabilities, but our admin does the initial, here's all the paperwork that you need. The director of disabilities contacts faculty to say this person is not allowed in class, and that's why we've done that, because that's what the disabilities office does anyway. Work with them.
That's exactly right. Like their expertise is in saying, this is the accommodation we need to make for the student. Here's how we're going to talk to faculty about it. Here's how we're going to keep track of it.
And he was key in developing our templates, our email templates, because he just adapted his accommodations template. We adapted this from his accommodations template.
Yeah, I think that's great. So I think that expertise to tap into is super helpful. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about food service. Tell me about that.
So what we're going to do, we haven't done this yet. So our plan is to have a menu out for the day, well, for the next day. And then those who are in quarantine isolation that need it will fill it out electronically, and then we'll gather that information, give that to the food service provider by the end of the day, and then they'll prepare for the next day. And we're going to utilize, we haven't quite determined who is going to deliver those yet. We have to kind of figure out who is safe to do it. Can it be our student workers just to deliver it to the area and then someone else move it to a room, or that kind of thing. So we haven't quite figured that out, but I think that's close. So
yeah, and that's an element, again, as students come back, it's going to get more complicated, but you want to have a starting point. And I think that's good encouragement for everybody. Come up with a plan and then adapt that, right? So that's what you're constantly having to do. That's working, that's not working anymore. So we gotta figure that out. So definitely an element as schools are thinking about what's going on to address. Okay, I want to make sure that there are no questions that we can pause for a minute and talk about. It's really interesting. A lot of the schools are saying that they're doing something really similar to you, where they're kind of having all these different elements where schools can choose from online or on class. And I'm curious to hear from our attendees, how many of you have seen or know that your campus has a plan for COVID? I've been really surprised at some of the schools I've been talking to recently that I assume that it's that the people I'm talking to haven't seen the plan, which is still a difficulty, because I'm like, hey, so what are you guys doing? And they say, I'm not sure. I don't know what the plan is. I think in some cases there's not a plan. So not only have the people I'm talking to not seen it, there's actually not one that's been created. So I'm curious to hear from you guys. If you have a plan, if you've seen it, are you familiar with it? The reason that I want to talk about Pharos tools is that I've gone in and built out some of the forms that Michael is talking about, some statuses, some workflow, and I'm going to push all of this out to you guys. So you will have the ability to go into Pharos 360 and start to use it to manage some of your cases. So let me show you, I'm going to show you in the system kind of what the workflow looks like. And then I'll give you a list of all of the things that we've created for you, and then explain to you how you can get those. And then we'll also have some more time for questions and answers. So the first thing is that identify. How are we going to identify students who have symptoms? And I'm going to deliver to your systems 2 different forms. The first one, so obviously you won't get at it the way I'm showing you, but this will be the easiest way for me to show it to you. The first one is a self-referral. So a student, actually, we can push out to a student's self-referral page, the ability for them to go in and say, hey, I just want to tell you what's happening here. My computer's acting very strange. Sorry. Give me 1 second. Okay. So that form, and you guys remember, all of these forms are customizable. So I'm delivering to you a basic workflow, but you can go in, and if you're like, I don't love that status, or I want to add a question, or we already have a form, you can go in and change these however you want. So the first one is going to be a self-referral. When students log on, they would have this accessible to them. We're just asking them, hey, do you have symptoms? How long? What symptoms? Have you been going to class? Have you taken a test? Where are you currently? Basically everything you need to start that case process of, okay, now we're going to start figuring out what's going on. So you might have an open case for COVID because somebody is doing a self-referral. I'm going to push that form out to you guys. We also developed a community referral form. So as Michael was saying, like maybe a faculty member knows a student's not doing well, or their peer, or something's happening where they're feeling kind of overwhelmed with what's going on. They want to be able to tell somebody, hey, you need to see this, right? So we have the origin of information. What do you know about this student? Are you reporting symptoms to us? Similar to the self-referral, some questions about travel, and then other relevant information. Both of those forms I'm pushing out to you. You might also have a case though where somebody calls you, a mom calls you and says, hey, this thing happened. So remember, when that happens, you can always just go in, search for the student here. And then when the student comes up, you'll be able to just click on open a new case. You can open it under the care area COVID-19 accommodations, which is where then you can go in and manage. So in terms of identifying self-referral, community referral forms, push both of those out. And then if you just have like somebody's calling, go in and open your case there. Okay, I have a couple of questions here that I want to address. So one of the questions, Rachel's asking, how much of this are we putting in early alert? Do we have to be careful if a student has tested positive, and be aware of their personal health concerns, want to be cognizant of HIPAA? Do you have a code you're using in early alert to indicate positive tests? So the nice thing about having Pharos 360 is that you can create those care areas that are locked down so that only the right people need to be able to see that. If you have somebody in accommodations, or if you have somebody in the health center who's the only person who needs to see that, you could do that. You also, though, can share that information with your team. So there's a lot of privacy to consider. The technology makes all of that possible for you to have that as locked down or share as much as you need. Michael, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
I mean, only the people on our task force have it. I don't know if this is the right interpretation, so I'm going to just cards on the table here. But one of the reasons the nurse wasn't involved is because she is bound by HIPAA in a different way. We're bound by FERPA, and need to know is very clear for us in this process, and so we can share information with each other without releasing, medical information that we're not. I'm not bound by HIPAA from a medical perspective. So
you guys have kind of taken it out of the, like, we're not talking about medical issues. We're talking about community issues and making sure that we're doing some tracing on there.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to show you a couple of other things. When those referrals come in, you'll be able to accept them. So either self-referral or community referral. And then this is really what your caseload will look like in the system. So I can see all of my students. I can see I'm taking care of them under COVID-19 fall accommodations. And then I'm also going to push out for you statuses and types, which Michael and his team came up with. And the idea, remember when we're talking about case status, we're talking about process tag. So here's where they are as we're going through each of these different elements. We have a test that's going to be administered. We're putting them in isolation, or we're putting them in isolation with this tag of test negative or test positive. We're putting them in quarantine, and we're resolving the case. And this is where, so you guys probably don't have access to this on your site right now, but I did want to show you under staging. You will, when you set that status of isolation or quarantine, you will have the ability to go in and set a due date, which is what Michael was talking about. So you should have that on your site probably in the next week. This is what it will look like. This is my staging site where we do a lot of testing. So it's a little bit messy, but I thought it was really important for you guys to be able to see what the due date looks like. And again, that's associated with that status. So when you set the status, you'll be able to say quarantine for 10 days. And then if you're doing checks with that person, as Michael said, and they have a longer fever, then you can change that due date. So here, if I said, I'm going to set this to, let's just say classroom concern, here I'll be able to go in and set that due date, and it will send me a reminder email the night before. And then also I can always sort by that here. So that's going to be a really, really helpful tool. The other thing that's coming in that release is your ability to attach forms to emails. So as Michael was saying, being able to send out to students, here's the form that we need you to fill out. Here are the things that we're concerned about. You can have all of that in 360 and it will be in the log, and it will be really easy for you to gain access to. Okay, so I'm gonna push out those statuses to you. You'll be able, Megan's very happy about our due date, so that's nice.
Oh, it's so good. With the due date and then the last contact, those are two really vital pieces in our communication. And we had to move past some people that really wanted a Google Doc or a spreadsheet or a Google Sheet or a spreadsheet to know where everybody was. And they've since kind of backed off on that and realized that we can manage it through the system. And we know there's some things we have to trust each other that things are getting done. But yeah, I think the last contact and the due dates is very, very helpful.
So that last contact would be where you're looking to see, it's been 3 days, nobody's talked to that student, we need to check in with them.
Yeah, and so, when we do an update, like just an intake form, we're doing it from a pivot table or a pivot form. So it's not, it doesn't record as a contact. So either I have to go in and say, hey, I took a phone call and intake that starts that we did contact this person. Or now, with the ability to attach documents, all we have to do is send that first email about, here's some of the documents that you might need, here's the early attestation form, here's all the stuff that you need. It's recorded in the system as they've been contacted, and so we won't have to do that. I want to record that part of it.
That will be great. That will save you some time.
Yeah.
So this COVID intake form is what Michael's talking about. We have a referral that comes in. We have to talk to the student and get some really specific details on symptoms, first date of symptoms, date of isolation, quarantine, all of that stuff that you would want to know and able to make a determination about what the next best step is. So this is another form that I'm going to push out to you. Again, remember that it's customizable, so there may be some stuff that you want to change on here, but it's a good way to say after that initial report, let's go back and do some digging on what's happening with that student specifically and get some of that specific information.
And in the process, I do this intake, I or the vice president do the intake, and then I go ahead and set the case status and the case type and the due date so that it's done.
Perfect. So you're going in and actually saying like, let's do the intake, then I'm going to say, here's the status and the date.
Okay.
And then you
accept the case, open it, set all that stuff so that it's ready for the next person to kind of take. And I typically don't talk to them after the first intake. I am just the intake person. So.
And then somebody else is kind of the point person for contact. And
contact check-ins for faculty communication. We've kind of split it up because when we had 40 at one time, it was really challenging to do the whole process.
From start to finish. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see here are COVID types. We're also going to push that out to you, so you'll have that. The last form that I want to show you is the check-in that Michael's talking about. So this is where you're going in and you're having a phone call or an email or text back and forth with the student. Hey, are you still experiencing symptoms? What are those symptoms? Are you able to keep up with your classes? And is there something else that the student needs? And I think, Michael, you guys actually have on your something that you were talking about, which is, does this student need counseling or chaplain? So are they feeling overwhelmed? Is there something that we need to do differently for them? But it's a great way to just in the middle of that quarantine process or after the first week to check in and say, hey, what's happening? We want to keep track of you and make sure that Okay, and then the last thing that I'm going to push out for you guys is a whole bunch of email templates. So we have email templates both from COVID faculty notifications. Students are not allowed to attend classes. You could go through and say, we just want to send that to all of our faculty. Here's what that looks like. Again, you can change that however you want, but I think it's helpful to have a baseline of this is some very good language to then maybe adapt. So student not permitted to attend class, student permitted to return to class, and then also some instructions about to the student about self-isolation and a COVID positive case. We have a link in there to some CDC regulations. And then when you guys get those emails, you'll be able to drop in things like the student conduct, or what is it? What do you guys call it? I can't remember. Care
team. Yeah.
The like, here's what you need to do. Here are the specific pages that are going to talk about what we expect from you. Those sorts of things. So let me just review that really quickly. Matt, can you share your screen? Let me stop sharing for a minute. So all of the tools that we're going to push to you, the way that we're going to do that is the COVID forms, we are actually going to push to your site. So you will be able to go in and access all of that. And Rachel, Elam, I might need some help remembering when we're going to get Josh to do this. I think it's either today or Monday, but it will be very quickly. So self-referral form, community form, intake form, and then also that check-in for students, those will be live on your site and you'll be able to go in and edit them. Some of the other things, so things like type and status, we have a document where we've just said, this is our recommendation for type and status. You may want to change those, so we're not going to push them to your site, but you would just go in and add types and status like you would normally do. So you'll have access to all of that. And then also those email templates, here's the list of all of them that we're going to share with you. Those are all also going to be templates that you can go in and tweak and do whatever you want to, and then load those into your form if you want to. So I want to, Rachel said, yes, our forms are going to be available very soon, which I think means either today or tomorrow. So that will be really nice. I want to go through and see if we have any other questions. Michael, is there anything I didn't ask you about that I should have?
I mean, I don't think so. I think the being flexible and knowing that you're going to have to adjust is pretty key. We come up with a new scenario. We talked to, so I will say, so we do, our task force is just, it's primarily student life people. We meet every morning at 8, no matter what, just to talk through the cases. Where are we?
Yeah.
Is this manageable? What do we need to do? Is this student returning phone calls? I had to call a student this morning and say, hey, you've been done with yours since the 16th of July. Where are you? Are you okay? And we've been calling him plenty. And I just said, hey, if you don't respond, I'm going to put a hold on your account. And he called right back. but I'd said, hey, buddy, we were getting nervous about you. We've called several times and you're not responding. You know, it was fine. But I think that's been a good thing. I didn't want it on my calendar at 8 o'clock every morning, but it's been very helpful. And they're brief. They take 10, 15 minutes. We're just talking through cases and making sure we know. We've had to anticipate, like, well, this person is going to be done with their quarantine or isolation on Saturday. We need to anticipate that so we're not having to work all weekend, or they may be free to come back on Saturday or Sunday. How do we do that? Is someone going to be on call for that? So those have been very helpful.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's like Anthony Malacuri's stand-up meetings, right? Where in the hospitality business, it's like every morning at 8 o'clock, we're not like sitting around a table. We're just going to gather in one place and I'm going to be like, here are the 5 things we got to do. What's happening, right? So I think the efficiency of that would be really helpful for schools to adopt. Just we got to touch base and know where we are. And
no one loves meetings like that.
No one loves meetings.
But it's been helpful to keep on top because, you know, we got other things going. It's not just COVID. So.
Yeah, that's right. We also have a whole other job that we were supposed to be doing, right? So I want to show you guys, you should have gotten this in the email inviting you to this session, but this is our link for all of the tools. You can go in and grab all of that stuff and put in the site statuses, types, and emails. And then, like I said, we're going to push the forms to you. What other questions? I think we have like 3 minutes. I want to make sure that I didn't miss any questions.
I did want to say one more thing. I think I remember going back to how this started. We early on at the very beginning of June or end of May, we did a tabletop exercise and it was awful. And the wrong people are in the room. And that's when we said, all right, we got to have a better process. And we didn't know, the case was way too complicated, and it helped us. Now we're going to go back in and do that tabletop exercise again, so that we can say, what are some other issues that we might need to iron out, or, that kind of thing. So I would encourage you, once you've done it, do that, run it through with everybody in the room, and then also talk to other people about it. Yeah. Yep.
I think that makes sense. Okay, so we'll push those tools out to you. Also, you guys, I want to remind you, next week we're doing our next session with Anthony, which has been a lot of fun for me. Michael and I were talking about, Anthony just has a lot of really great energy, and he brings such a helpful perspective to our industry. So we are going to
chutzpah. Like
he's got a lot of chutzpah. I'm happy that I am a Yankee so that I can keep up with him a little bit.
So good.
Next week, we are going to be talking about how to anticipate students' needs, which is just such a key for keeping them both physically safe and healthy, and also mentally healthy, which I think is going to be a big challenge for us in the fall. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can anticipate their needs. Love for you to join us. You guys, as always, we want to be good partners to you. So if you look through the tools that we have and it would be helpful to have a meeting, I'm happy to do that. Really happy to spend time with you in any way that is useful. Be looking for those forms. Michael, thank you so much. I've said to you 5 times, I cannot thank you enough for being a leader in this area and for helping us package up stuff so that, like, my struggle is always starting from zero is very hard. So just the idea that we have this work that you and your team have done before us, that then all of these schools can adapt, I'm just very grateful for those tools.
And let me say, I'm just the ugly face that you're representing. There's the people that are, and we've got some really incredible people that have really driven this, and it's really good. So
yeah, well, thank you so much. You guys, thank you. Have a good day, and we will talk to you later.